America could destroy far more of Iran's military power than Iran could ever destroy of America's. So here's the question: if the United States is overwhelmingly stronger militarily, then why can't Washington simply remove Iran's leverage over the Strait of Hormuz? The answer is surprisingly simple, because the most important weapon in Hormuz may not be a missile, it may be uncertainty. The United States has the world's most powerful military. It has aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, advanced aircraft, long-range missiles, satellites, and a global network of military bases. Iran cannot compete with that, but Iran, doesn't need to. Because right next to Iran is one of the most important maritime choke points on Earth, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. And through this narrow passage moves an enormous share of the world's energy. In 2024, roughly 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products pass through Hormuz every day. That was around 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption, and roughly 1/5 of the world's liquefied natural gas trade also passed through the strait. Think about what that means. This is not simply a piece of water between Iran and Oman. It is a connection between the Persian Gulf and the global economy. And that is exactly what makes Hormuz so strategically important. Iran does not have to defeat the American military. It only has to make the world uncertain about what happens next. Will the next tanker pass safely? Will insurance companies raise their prices? Will shipping companies avoid the area? Will energy traders start pricing in a possible disruption? Will governments begin preparing for an energy crisis? Those questions can create consequences before the strait is ever completely closed. And that is the real Hormuz calculation. The strait itself is not controlled by Iran. It lies between Iran and Oman, but Iran occupies the northern side of the waterway. That geography gives Tehran direct access to one of the world's most important maritime choke points. And Iran has spent decades building its military strategy around that geography. Instead of trying to build a navy capable of fighting the United States ship for ship, Iran has focused heavily on missiles, drones, surveillance, smaller naval forces, coastal systems, and other capabilities designed to make operations around its coastline more complicated. The goal is not necessarily to destroy the U.S. Navy. The goal is to make the U.S. Navy work harder for every mile of water, make the environment more dangerous, make the operation more expensive, and most importantly, make the outcome less predictable. That distinction matters because military power is not only about who has more ships or more aircraft, it is also about whether that power can be converted into reliable control. And Hormuz makes that difficult. The waterway is narrow. The surrounding coastline is strategically important, and the economic consequences of even a limited disruption can spread far beyond the battlefield. We have seen this before. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, commercial shipping became part of the wider conflict in the Gulf. Ships were attacked, maritime traffic became more dangerous, and international forces eventually became involved in protecting commercial shipping. The important lesson was not that the strait had to be completely closed, it was that the perception of danger could change behavior. And that lesson still matters today. Because markets do not always wait for a crisis to become real. They react to the possibility of a crisis. If the perceived risk around Hormuz rises, insurance costs can rise. Shipping companies can demand higher compensation. Energy traders can begin pricing in future shortages. Governments can start preparing emergency measures, and investors can begin assuming that an energy shock is possible. In other words, the market does not need the tanker to disappear. It only needs to believe that the tanker might not arrive on time. That is where uncertainty becomes a weapon. But there is a major problem for Iran. A complete closure of Hormuz would be an extremely aggressive move. It could disrupt enormous energy flows. It could trigger a major international military response, and it could also hurt Iran itself, because Iran is part of the same regional economic system. So Tehran faces a difficult balancing act. Apply too little pressure and nobody changes their behavior. Apply too much pressure and the response could become overwhelming. That is the trap. Iran wants to create enough uncertainty to gain leverage, but not so much uncertainty that it triggers a war it cannot control. And that is why Hormuz should not be thought of as a simple on and off switch. Iran cannot simply press a button and shut down the global energy system. Instead, Hormuz is better understood as a pressure point, a place where relatively limited actions can create disproportionately large reactions. And those reactions would not stay inside the Persian Gulf. They could spread across the global economy, because most of the oil and condensate moving through Hormuz in 2024 was ultimately headed toward Asian markets, China, India, Japan, South Korea. These economies are deeply connected to energy supplies moving through the region, and the same is true for liquefied natural gas. Around 1/5 of global LNG trade passed through Hormuz, with Qatar responsible for most of the LNG flows from the Persian Gulf. So a serious Hormuz crisis would not simply be American-Iranian confrontation. It could quickly become a global economic problem. Asian economies could face higher energy costs. Shipping companies could face higher operating costs. Gulf states could be forced to protect critical energy infrastructure. The United States and its partners could increase maritime security operations, and financial markets could begin pricing in the possibility of a prolonged energy shock. There are alternative routes. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have pipelines that can bypass part of the Strait's traffic. Iran has also developed the Gorajask pipeline to give some of its exports access to the Gulf of Oman without passing through Hormuz. But these alternatives cannot simply replace everything that normally moves through the Strait, and that is why Hormuz remains so important. There is vulnerability, but there is no perfect substitute, and that creates several possible paths during a crisis. The first is deterrence. Iran maintains the capability to threaten disruption, but it avoids taking actions that would immediately trigger a major war. In this situation, the threat itself becomes part of the strategy. The second possibility is limited maritime disruption. A confrontation involving commercial ships, military vessels, drones, or other incidents could increase uncertainty without immediately turning into a full-scale war. But even a limited incident can become dangerous if markets begin expecting the next incident to be worse. Then comes the third possibility, a much larger confrontation around the Strait. At that point, shipping routes, energy, infrastructure, and military forces could all become part of the conflict. And then there is the most dangerous scenario, direct U.S Iran escalation. A confrontation that begins at sea could expand into attacks against military key positions. And once that happens, the original calculation becomes much harder to control, because every player has a different objective. Iran wants enough pressure to gain leverage. The United States wants to keep maritime traffic moving without allowing the crisis to become a larger war. Gulf states want to protect their energy infrastructure without becoming direct targets. And energy importing countries want to prevent a regional conflict from turning into a global energy shock. This is why the question is not, can Iran defeat America? It cannot. The United States has overwhelming conventional and military superiority. But conventional military rankings don't capture every form of strategic power. They don't measure geography, they don't measure insurance premiums, they don't measure market psychology, and they don't measure the political pressure created when governments have to prepare for a disruption that may never actually happen. That is the real Hormuz calculation. Iran's advantage is not that it can simply shut the strait whenever it wants. Its advantage is that it sits next to a waterway the global energy system cannot easily ignore, and that creates a dangerous form of asymmetric leverage. Yeah, because if Iran applies too little pressure, nobody changes their behavior. But if Iran applies too much pressure, the response could become overwhelming. That is the trap. The same importance that gives Iran leverage also gives the United States and other powers a powerful reason to respond. So Hormuz is not simply a weapon, it is a bargaining tool. A bargaining tool built from geography, energy dependence, shipping risk, and uncertainty. And that is why the real question is not whether Iran can control the Strait of Hormuz. The real question is how much uncertainty Iran can create around it before the cost of using that leverage becomes greater than the leverage itself. Because America may have more ships, more aircraft, more missiles, and far greater military power. But in Hormuz, Iran does not need to match any of that. It only needs to make the world think twice before assuming that the next tanker will pass without a problem.